Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 86 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a flower stall in a market in the East End of London. The stall's proprietor, Michael, is in full flow of his sales patter with a customer. He is jittery from lack of sleep, from a residue of cocaine and alcohol, and from grief at the recent death of his father, whose business he has just inherited. Michael is 39 and white, the latter a fact which is essential to his understanding of his identity, for Michael is wrestling not just with the material inheritance from his father, but also with the values he represented and espoused to his family, especially his flagrant racism. This bigotry is central to Michael's and his family's life, because Michael's best friend from school days, Delroy, happens to be black, and his sister Carly has been secretly seeing Delroy. This is the combustible dynamic that propels Roy Williams and Clint Dyer's state-of-the-nation trilogy of plays, Death of England, an acclaimed revival of which has just concluded its run at the new Soho Place theatre in London's West End. The three individual plays of the trilogy have had a decade-long, often challenging gestation, beginning in 2014 with a 10-minute film introducing Michael, grieving for his late father and grappling with his legacy. Michael was played by Rafe Spall, who returned to the role when the first full-length play was mounted at the National Theatre in early 2020. Although the play was a single long monologue, the story and characters in Michael's family demanded to be expanded, beginning with the story being retold from the perspective of Michael's friend, Delroy. The newly written second part was dramatically cut short when, on the very night of its press opening at the National Theatre in the autumn of 2020, Britain and its theatres were locked down again. Like many of the nation's theatres, the National was forced to pivot, and the writers created an inventive amalgam of the two original monologues, which was then filmed on the Littleton stage and broadcast on television in November 2021 as Death of England Face to Face. However, that was not the end of the story or the play. In October 2023, the third part of the family story, Closing Time, was performed at the National, when the spotlight turned to Delroy's mother, Denise, and his girlfriend, Michael's sister, Carly. Finally, this summer, all three parts of the Death of England trilogy have been brought together in the new production at Soho Place, with the chance even to see all three plays in a single day. Williams and Dyer have also taken the chance to update topical references in the plays to make this a really current state-of-the-nation event. I'm delighted to say that the playwright Roy Williams is with me today to discuss his rich and topical play. It's a great privilege to welcome you to the Play Podcast, Roy. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I must do a brief, proper introduction to you, Roy. Roy Williams is one of Britain's most important playwrights, exploring the fault lines of race, class, and nationhood, as critic Dan Rebellato describes his work, in more than 20 plays, including Sing Your Heart Out for the Lads, Sucker Punch, The No Boys Cricket Club, Fallout, and recently an adaptation of Sam Selvin's 1956 Windrush novel, The Lonely Londoners. Roy has also written for radio and television, including 8 seasons of the contemporary crime series The Interrogation on BBC Radio and the BAFTA-nominated TV film Soon Gone, A Windrush Chronicle. He was awarded an OBE for services to drama in 2008. So, Roy, I want to take you back to the beginning and ask you, what was the germ of the idea for Death of England? Did it start with just the character of Michael?
No, it started as a short film in 2014. I was commissioned by Royal Court of the Guardian. They wanted to commission 6 writers to write very short films that were eventually going to be put on the Guardian website. And the stipulation was the films had to be inspired by the sections of the Guardian on Saturday. So you got sport, fashion, music, food, education, politics. And I chose sports because I've often had sports. I mean, you listed Singing Heart Out for the Lads, and I always find sport, particularly football, was a really useful metaphor for how the state of England is at the moment. And in 2014, it was the World Cup in Brazil. And England, being typical England, played awful. They were absolutely dreadful. And the mood wasn't great. It was all very downcast. But then also at that time, at least for me, the whole debate about whether Britain should leave the European Union, the whole Brexit issue, for me, that really started to come into effect around about that time. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody was discussing it. Everyone has all different views on it. And that continued up until the votes. So that was very much in the air. And it felt very much to me, it felt like a death. It felt like this country is dying. This country doesn't know what it wants to be, and it's somehow, as a part of it, it's dying. But which part? The good part or the bad part? And that just seemed to marry when I was commissioned to write the film. It felt destined, had to be sort of football orientated and also to reflect the growing mood. So it was a simple setup. When Clint came on board to direct it, we discussed it, and he felt the same. In terms of, it felt like it was a funeral. So we said, okay, well, literally, that's what our film should be about.
Ah,
A funeral. This young man addressing his congregation, the death of his father, football loving, right wing man, and then he just launches, he just attacks everybody. He's attacking the country, and then more importantly, he's attacking himself. And it all goes crazy and violent and very, very sad.
and attacks his father, doesn't he, at his father's funeral?
Exactly, exactly. And it felt like, so even though it was called Death of England, I think the title itself can be quite ambiguous. Because, yes, it's not literally a death, it's also a question. Is the England really, really dying? And another question, what kind of England will it be? What kind of England can it be? And I think in his weird ranting way, that's exactly what Michael was asking. He was like asking, who are we now? Where are we going? What are we doing? Even though he comes at it in a very aggressive, racist, and violent way, that's kind of what he's asking for. He's at a loss. He doesn't know who he is and what he believes in anymore. He questions himself because he grew up hearing his dad make all these comments, and sometimes he went along with it. But then he also had a best friend called Delroy who was black, so he's confused. But up until his dad dies, he feels no, I won't rock the boat, I won't say anything. But then his dad dies, and that challenges him to look at himself, reflect upon himself, which in a sense we all do when we lose a loved one. We can't help but not do that. There's always a time for inner reflection. You kind of look at yourself, kind of go, who am I now? Where am I going? And how long have I got?
Yeah, the death of a parent is a real rite of passage, isn't it?
Oh, very much so.
You evaluate the impact they've had on your life, the values they set for you in some way, how you're going to live without them. A lot of soul searching goes on at that time of life.
Absolutely. And that was a deliberate choice on our part for Michael to go through something that a lot of people, regardless of who they are, where they come from, can relate to. I.e., as you said, the loss of loved ones. I certainly related to it as when I was co-writing the first play with the loss of my parents and dealing with that in very different ways. My father died first. I didn't have much of a relationship with him. Actually, I didn't have any relationship with him. I barely knew the man. And then my mother went a year later. So my grieving process was very, very different for each of them.
I can imagine, yes. Well, it's fascinating you talk about football being one of the inspirations for the death of England.
Yeah.
Why is it we invest so much hope and feeling into the national team performance? What's going on there? You talk in the place, it's a proxy for feelings about the nation.
Exactly. I find it fascinating, and I don't think I've come up with a full answer to that, in spite of all of the things I've written about football and England. I mean, to give you an answer now, I just feel because it's a traditional working class game, it feels like it belongs to us. And Britain itself, it's an island on its own, so we're not quite with Europe. I don't think we ever have been. So we want to grab anything that feels that belongs to us. We want to grab anything that gives us an identity, regardless of how bad we are at it. And our success in football is very up and down, and a lot of downs, but we still hang on to it.
Yes, because there are times where we seem to even love the despair.
Exactly, but it's still ours. It's our game. We invented it. We gave it to the world, even though not all times of the world are better at it than we are. But we still stubbornly hold on to it.
It's amazing the strength of feelings of anger and disappointment and pride sometimes. But also, I was thinking that potential victory is aligned to recapturing some lost historical glory.
Exactly.
And to be able to claim to be superior to other nations, as some would like to believe England once was and can be again. I think there's something symbolic in that possibly. Because in fact, I think Michael says his father said somewhere he wanted to feel better than the rest, more powerful, more dominant. So it does become that kind of symbol.
Yeah, but the joke is kind of on his dad. The character's name is Alan Fletcher. The joke is on, yeah, we can be all of those things. But I just don't understand why we need to be so uniformed about it, where we all need to look and act a certain way. That's nonsense. And I dearly wish this country would get over itself and embrace diversity. But I think there's something in that. There's definitely something in that. There seems to be more of a debate this country is having itself. And in a way, that's a good thing.
So I'm interested that you said that the title, Death of England, almost had a question mark in it, because it sort of sounds like it's pretty final. It's this is it. England's dead and over.
That's one way of looking at it, yeah. But I think there's more to it.
I mean, there is a lot expressed, I think, in the plays that suggest you're talking about a general sense of malaise, as you've just been talking about how we feel about Britain, that things have been going backwards in some way. And then particularly perhaps for sections of the working class population of this country who feel left behind, which may have fueled some of what Brexit vote was all about.
Yeah.
And Michael says at some point, we are shit at everything. I mean, I think he starts from football, but he seems to think that's true of everything, because he feels like one of the disenfranchised white working class, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There is a section that feel they've been left behind, but I think they're channeling their anger in the wrong way. It seems to be a ridiculous human instinct. You always got to find someone
else to blame.
You feel you've got to be better than somebody else, and everything else is a distraction and an annoyance, I feel.
They do talk about how Michael talks about his father always blaming everyone else who's not English for our trouble. So there's that strain of anti-immigration in the plays, that also part of the Brexit vote, I think. And yet also Delroy, the black character, and we'll talk about exactly who these people are in more detail in a second, but he's also pretty disillusioned with Britain.
Yeah.
And actually talks about it being dead. And he wants to bring the whole thing down because he's not done very well out of it, he thinks, either.
Well, exactly. I think out of the three plays, I would say for me, Delroy is, for obvious reasons, if you like, the most personal one, because it's seen through the eyes of a black man who's not that younger than me, and his experiences growing up. So, we hear Michael's side, we hear the white working class and how they feel marginalised and disenfranchised and forgotten about. But then you've got a black man born in this country, born and bred, with the same opportunities and going to a very similar school as Michael did, but he feels left behind. So what's that about? I mean, that was one of the things why we wrote Play, because we wanted to kind of throw it back at the Michaels and the Allens as well. Just said, okay, what about Delroy here? He was born here. He grew up with you, Michael, and he feels disenfranchised. So who's to blame for his problems? Explain that to me.
He doesn't feel like he's had an equal chance or share in this society, does he, at all?
No, he's... the starting point for that play was a line that Michael said to him in the first play, when Michael's had that sort of big drunken rant at his dad's funeral, and he attacks Delroy and says, you may sound like us, but you'll never be one of us. And Delroy really took that to heart. That really plagued him.
Yeah, that hurt.
That really hurt, and that drove him, the actions that happened to him in the first place, that very much fueled a lot of his anger. And I've grown up in this country. I was born and bred like Delroy, and I still recall many times where I've been made to feel like that, many times when people on all sides, on all very different sides, have all said that to me in various different ways. You may sound like us, but you'll never be one of us. And it's a devastating thing to hear. You're just going, this is my country. If I don't belong here, where the hell do I go? Where can I belong? Explain that to me. Yeah, that was the engine that really kickstarted the Delroy story.
So I wonder whether the Death of England title is about the death of an outdated idea of England.
Exactly.
That something has to change to allow for a rebirth of some kind.
Absolutely.
The all-white England for the English to be replaced by something else.
Yeah, and that's key, because I think that's how we set to end each of the three plays, with that question, that kind of, okay, what now? And I think we leave each character in the end of the play with, okay, they're now on a new voyage of self-discovery. Each one ends with a sense of hope and just kind of saying, okay, it's up to you now. You are England. I mean, that's essentially who these characters are in the world of the play. They are England. There's a reason why the set is a cross. It's flag of St. George, and they're all walking up and down on it, all in their own way, trying to lay claim to a sense of Englishness, and they're battling it out with themselves and with each other.
Yeah, as we said at the beginning, a state of the nation through these individuals. Mm-hmm. These plays have really touched a nerve. I found it, every performance I went to of the three plays, there were voices in the audience shouting their agreement with things that were said by the characters, especially to the very topical or social comments, and people were on their feet cheering at the end. And it would certainly be justified by the performances of the actors, which were just astounding. These lengthy monologues full of intensity. But it feels like more than that. Why do you think they're getting such an intense reaction, these plays?
Well, I like to think because finally we're saying things that that kind of audience want to hear and they want to see. Married also with the fact that those worlds, those voices are not often expressed on the London stage, particularly the West End stage as well. So add that to the mix. I like to think people feel, oh, yeah, this is what theatre can be. And also they're telling stories about things that matter to them and should matter to them. They're invested in these characters. So I like to think that's why.
You're right. They feature working class characters and a black working class character, which you don't see frequently on the West End stage. And it's a world which we recognize. And it was a very diverse audience as well, which was really encouraging.
Oh, that was lovely. Yeah, it warms my heart to see that.
I want to talk to you about the form of the plays, Roy, because the first two parts are written as monologues, with the actors playing Michael and then Delroy also enacting conversations or speeches with other characters, but they are doing that themselves. Why did you choose to do these plays as monologues? What do you get that's different from the more conventional form of having multiple characters on the stage?
Well, we tried to do it as a convention. I mean, we wrote the original short film where it was just Rafe as Michael speaking to his congregation who were there so that you saw them, but he had the most lines. It was very much his show. And then once Clint and I had the idea of developing it as a play, we did the traditional, okay, let's just open it out. Let's have all the other characters there. Let's set it on one day, on the day of his dad's funeral. And then, as you saw in the play, things happen to him. But he engages with his mum, his sister, Delroy, and various other characters as well. And we got to work on that because we've got a bunch of actors. And Clint, as well as being an amazing director, he's also an actor and he's worked with Mike Leigh. So he kind of borrowed the Mike Leigh technique of how he creates character in his films.
Improvisation.
Improvisation. He has an idea, he sets the actors kind of fight to create their own backstory and then come back. Improvisation, he films them and then he goes away and writes the script. So that's kind of what we borrowed to do that. So we had loads of scenarios between Delroy and Michael, Delroy and Carly and Denise. And then once we assembled all of that, when we began writing it, and just as we were on the verge of delivering it to the National Theatre, I looked back on the script and I felt, this is too big. And the original character, Michael, was just getting lost and submerged. And then, I don't know, the idea just popped into my head. What if we wrote it as a one-person show?
After all that, with all these actors and improvisation.
Exactly. But I took myself back to the original film because that felt essentially like that was a one-person, and I really wanted that energy back.
And so what do you think it achieves when it's different as a monologue?
It's one person speaking to the audience, and I think it gives him the floor, as it were. Because I think, traditionally, I mean, let's be honest, in theatre, particularly West End theatres, it's mostly going to be white middle class, not white working class. And I just thought there's something quite mischievous about having someone like him in that audience and they're locked in that space with him and they have to hear him out.
Yeah, you're very much locked in. You're right. 90 minutes plus with him raging at you.
Exactly. So I thought that was quite a challenge to do.
And also, you're right that he's basically appealing to us directly. There's very much an engagement with the audience.
Well, yeah. I mean, when one thinks of one-person shows, it's easy to go to Alan Bennett's Talking Heads. And whilst those are beautifully written and there's a lot to admire about that, I wasn't interested so much in that. I mean, I think I was aware of the big ask we're asking of any actor to play that role. And I think we felt to help him along, we abandoned the fourth wall. So he knows where he is. He knows he's in a theatre talking to an audience. So he engages with them. So in essence, they're his co-stars. They're really well into the action with him. But also I wanted Michael and then Delroy to have the energy of a stand-up comic. It's like a routine.
Yes, the energy is extraordinary. And that comes from the interaction as well, doesn't it?
Very much so. But yeah, it's dependent on it. And I had a lot of fun while I was writing it, just watching video clips of a lot of my favourite stand-up comics, just to get that kind of energy and how they respond. And more important, how they tell stories as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how you engage with this character and they draw you into their perspective and their feelings. As I said, they're appealing to you. And in a way, you're won over. You can't help but be won over to their perspective, even with their faults. Even then, you're watching them behave badly at times. We feel their humanity and that connection with them.
Yeah, and that was a big challenge to do that, particularly Michael, because, he says not very nice things, very confrontational things, very racist things, very hurtful things. But it's on us, myself and Clint, to make him as fully rounded as possible. We're not asking you to like him. We just want you to understand him. And that was a challenge for us to do that. But from what we've heard of audiences, I think they buy into that. They've got that.
Yes, absolutely. Now, the trilogy consists of three separate but intertwined pieces. Some of the same events are described in all three parts, but told, as we've said, from the different perspectives of the different narrators. For those who haven't been lucky enough to see the plays, Roy, could we give listeners a brief introduction to the main characters? We've talked about Michael and Delroy, but as well as a summary of maybe the key plot events, starting with Michael's story in part one. Very briefly, what happens in part one with Michael?
Well, the key thing that happens to Michael is his father dies after they sat down to watch an England football match in which England lose. And then his death prompts him to kind of reevaluate himself.
In fact, sorry to interrupt, his dad dies actually watching the football in the pub.
And expressing racist views.
It's an extraordinary moment. He gets so wound up at the England failure that he has a heart attack.
Exactly. He has a heart attack and dies. And then that leads Michael on the road of questioning who he is and what he believes in. And it really hits home to him when he discovers something he never knew about his father.
Yes, we're going to come to that. We won't give that spoiler away quite yet. So one of the central elements of Michael's story is, as we've been touching on, is his father, Alan's racism and how it affects him and what the legacy of his father's attitudes will be on Michael and on his sister, Carly. Because it certainly seems that Alan's attitudes are horribly toxic. The picture drawn initially is of a pretty stereotypical white working class racist. But it's actually more complicated than it appears, isn't it? What Alan thinks about race.
Yes. It's not that dissimilar from what Michael's going through. From when Michael receives the news about his father, I think we discover that Alan was on his own sort of little journey of self-doubt and what he believes in as well. His racist views are not as formed in his head as people think they are.
Is there some element that it's sort of for public consumption, his racist expressions, his attitudes?
Yeah.
There's stuff in the play that suggests that, for example, they go to the football together, he and Michael, when Michael's young, and he talks about the abuse that's shouted at the black players on the football pitch, and that his dad covers Michael's ears, trying to protect him from it in some way.
Yeah.
And he doesn't join in the racist taunts. And his father repeatedly says, there's a time and a place. What does he mean? Because at home, he still has friends around and they're all talking, how they want to take the country back from the blacks. And so is it just a difference between what he does in private and what happens in public?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think it just helps to highlight just how, if you really look at it, just how nonsensical racism actually is. What on earth is it built on? And I think what it's built on is just garbage that maybe the generation whipped up from a previous generation and previous generations. They just seem to be regurgitating the same things. And we really strip it away. It's based on nothing. It's absolute nonsense. There's no facts behind it. It's not policy. It's just a ridiculous, worn out, stupid, unhelpful attitude.
Isn't there something that's about, it's collectively accumulated somehow? It's about a gang mentality almost that feeds each other. Because the weird thing is that on an individual basis, and there's some evidence here in the play too, isn't there? Because we learn that Alan cheers on Delroy when he's playing football or boxing. It's like Delroy, the individual black kid, is okay, but that doesn't mean that he still isn't racist for every other black in the world. That just doesn't make sense.
It does not make sense. I mean, again, when I was a kid, I lost count the amount of times when I would have people say, "Oh, we don't mean you, Roy." They would say these things about black people. They said to me, "Oh, we don't mean you." And as a kid, you don't question it. But then, as I became an adult, I look back on that. I kind of think, that's nonsense. What on earth is that supposed to mean? Where is that coming from? And that kind of invites me to come to this. Do you really believe in this? Where was this belief coming? Was it just habits you're all doing? You're just saying it because, I don't know, maybe your mum or your dad or your best mate or your big brother said it.
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure. You need to say it as well. So we definitely wanted to channel that into the character of Alan and sort of say that stuff he believed in, he's feed it into Michael. And then maybe there was a point when he realizes or he questions, he just says, what am I doing? Do I really believe in all of this? Do I really feel this? And so that was what built up to the interesting twist that we had in the play. Those are what Michael finds out about him.
Yeah, so you've set this up very well because Michael discovers some way through the first play that his father has some sort of secret life almost. He meets this friend of his father's after the funeral called Rees, who's South Asian and has a restaurant locally that I think his father used to visit, but also his father rented his flower stall from him. But it also turns out that he rented a room from Riz above his restaurant where he would take himself off for some private time. And Riz shows him this room, and it's full of books that his father's been reading, trying to improve himself to understand the world. This is a real shock, isn't it?
Yeah.
That Alan is pursuing this kind of secret agenda of self-improvement and enlightenment, and it's a contradiction to the stereotypical assumptions about what this man is like.
Exactly. It's interesting because from discussions I've had with some people, that's the moment in the play they found difficult to believe. That, someone like Alan.
Yeah, I read, Roy. I was going to ask you. A critic suggested that this other side to Alan is not just improbable, but implausible. So you're saying some people have had problem with it.
I have to respectfully disagree with that. I mean, if that's what they feel, fine. But that's precisely the reason why we included it. We included it because we wanted to make it dare to be plausible that someone like Alan is questioning himself. Yeah, not all racists will be doing that, but how do we know they're not? How do we know what's going on in their heads? We don't know that. It's comfortable to think of the Allens of this world in a certain way. I know I do. I know there's a part of me that sees them in a certain way. But also, I have to challenge myself to kind of think, okay, well, they're human beings as well. And we all are capable of having more than one thought in our heads. Even they are.
Well, that's a prejudice, the reverse of racism, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Putting people in a box and labeling them.
Yeah, but it's okay. People disagree. That's fine. They don't have to believe in every single aspect of it. But we did. And that's where we include that. We stand by it.
One of the positive elements, of course, it suggests it's possible not to think as he does, and that people like him don't necessarily.
Exactly.
The contradiction in Alan certainly confused Michael. This discovery certainly confuses him, and he's tortured by the way he sees his relationship with his father throughout, isn't he? He seems to not agree with his worst attitudes, yet he can't stop loving him, of course, or seeking his approval. And he feels, I think a lot of the time, doesn't he, that he hasn't had his father's approval. I think he thinks his father and his mother have never rated him.
Yeah, that's definitely how he feels. I mean, and the mother certainly makes her feelings known to Michael after father dies. And she really launches at Michael and just says, you're always disappointment, you always let us down and such. So, yeah, so that's added to the mix in terms of what Michael's going through. Yeah, and he definitely wanted his father's approval. And again, that's also something a lot of us can relate to. We want our parents' approval. We want them to respect us. We want them to love us. So that was a deliberate point to put that strain through the play. Because again, we wanted to make Michael as much as possible relatable to whoever's watching. We dared and sort of say, okay, you're maybe a different class to him, but come on, what he's experiencing, we've all experienced that in our own way as well. So
it's very poignant, actually, because, of course, they both miss their chance to say what they really think to each other. Alan leaves a recording, actually, for him where he does tell him he loves him and encourages him to stand up for something, to be better than him. Alan wanted to be a better man than he was.
Yeah.
And was disappointed in himself or angry with himself even, I think.
Absolutely.
And then tries to leave some positive legacy for Michael. There's also an impact on Carly of Alan, her father's racism, because she's secretly seeing Delroy, but hides that fact from her father because she thinks he'll go nuts. And even, and this is a really poignant bit, pretends to be racist.
Yes.
I mean, that's painful, that.
It happens. Yeah. It's very painful. And again, that comes from a sense of truth. I grew up with a lot of Michaels and Carlys as well. And I've had experiences of that where they say one thing to you and then they behave a certain way with their parents in order to gain their approval. That very much happens.
Oh, God, that's sad, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very sad. That's what racism does. And as I said, it's just an accumulation of ridiculous, outdated, stupid attitudes. I wish the entire world would work much harder to consign to the bin.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of part one of Michael's story, I think we see some hope for his future, don't we? He begins to exhibit some sort of courage and integrity of his own. He seems to have learned something from particularly his discovery about his father. Is that fair?
Yeah, he does go on a journey, which is kind of alluded to in part two, particularly when he's reunited with Delroy again. But by then, it's Delroy's story that sort of takes centre stage. And he refuses to let Michael off easy. there's a lot for him to make up to. And in an interesting way, we kind of carry that on into all the plays, even though play ends with them on a sense of hope, but they've still got a lot to atone for in the next one.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into part two. Give us a quick synopsis of what happens to Delroy in his part of the play. Where do we find him at the start?
Well, again, I mean, like Michael, he goes through a sort of day from hell, actually, because he's on his way to the hospital. Carly's pregnant. She's about to give birth. And on the way there, he's falsely stopped and arrested by the police for a crime he didn't commit, which sadly is something, even now, that's still something that hovers over any black man who goes out onto the streets.
Has this happened to you?
When I was younger, I was stopped and searched, yeah, several times. That was a norm for young black men of our generation to be stopped and searched by the police. I was never treated as badly as Delroy was, but it's still an uncomfortable feeling. You see the blue lights, they pull up, they ask you your name, they want to see some ID, they check it out, and then they give it to you, and they say, okay, on your way. It's very unsettling.
That would be, absolutely. And in this case, I think it's a mistaken identity, but then it degenerates. It somehow, they get the wrong end of the stick, the police, because he resists.
Exactly, and then he ends up injuring one of the officers for which he's arrested and charged for. It's a very unfortunate set of circumstances. And he feels justly angry about that because he feels, no, I've done everything right. I was born in this country. I pay my tax. I've got a job, even though it's not a popular job he has, but it's still a job nonetheless. He's a bailiff. He's the one when people are at their worst, can't pay their bills or in debt to the bank, and then whoever they owe money to, right, say, okay, well, we're calling your loan in, and then they send people to go to your house and remove property and possessions to help clear off your debts.
Roy, I thought that's an extraordinary choice you made of giving Delroy the job of bailiff. As you say, very, very unpopular.
Again, and that was a deliberate move on our part. We didn't want to make it easy for the audience. We didn't want to make it too easy for them to feel sympathy for Delroy. Even so, in spite of that, that's still a job he's entitled to have. And also his politics, to me, are questionable because he's more conservative, far more conservative than I am.
He voted for Boris Johnson twice.
And he voted for Boris Johnson twice, as he says so with pride in the play. But again, who are we to make assumptions about which way a black person should vote?
You're challenging expectations, aren't you?
Yeah, he was challenging expectations, and I thought that was very key, and also to make him as interesting as possible. But in spite of that, what happens to him, again, like I said, happens to so many black men of that generation today still. I mean, I'm several years older than Delroy, but it still makes me cry when I hear about that stuff going on now. You're just going, what's that about? What the hell is going on? So that's his day from hell. He just goes, no, I'm black, I'm British, but I'm still made to feel like I'm a second-class citizen as he tries to get out of this predicament and go to the hospital for this amazing day, which again, that's something else we can all relate to, the birth of a child. That's supposed to be the greatest day of your life. It's one of the greatest days of your life, and it's taken away from him, and he's angry about that.
Yeah, the frustration would be so intense that he's trying to get there and is being detained. So in part one, we hear a lot about racism as expressed by the white characters. And in this play, the second part with Delroy's voice, we hear about it from the other side, so to speak, about what it had been like for him to live in England as a black man, including this central incident of being stopped and arrested. And then he ends up actually in court, which we'll come to. It seems to me the larger theme of Delroy's story is how black people are still not accepted on equal terms, as we discussed at the beginning, in British society, and how that's manifest in racist stereotyping, like stop and search. And you said earlier about that line that you may sound like us, act like us, but you'll never be one of us. That's a truth that just seems to play out in his life.
Absolutely. It's heartbreaking. The times I've been told that and how it's made me feel has been, I would say, the lowest points of my life.
Yeah. And then there's another phrase that Michael tries to claim to Delroy, we're all in it together, but he doesn't feel like he's in it together, does he? And his experience does not tell him that.
No, exactly. I think that makes him far angrier than be told you don't belong here, for Michael to come along and say, oh, but we're all in it together. He's just in it together. Yeah, to a point we are. He doesn't want to feel these things. He just wants to be for the birth of his child. He doesn't want all that stuff to matter to him. But circumstances and life and England as it is, can't help but do that. I certainly feel that. I still feel that to a certain degree now.
Roy, I want to ask you, because one of his most telling lines to me is he says, they didn't want me to be me. And what he means is they don't really understand how a black person can express their own identity and be accepted at that they have to pretend to not be black, to have to be someone other than themselves to succeed in a white world?
Again, I mean, if we focus on that aspect of race, that is another sort of accumulation of just noise and ridiculousness and just stupidity in terms of like, you should be that kind of black person. And for me, that always makes me want just to ask them, what do you mean? What is being black? What is being black to you? I know what being black is to me, and it's vast. It's huge. It's humongous. It's not one thing. It cannot possibly be any one thing. So what are you talking about?
And the image is often projecting an image of a black man as a threat, which is behind this stop and search. And Delroy's mom even says, you got to play them at their own game. You can't be mouthy. And
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I've had the lessons. Yeah, my mum has often said, don't say this. If you run into trouble with the police, don't behave like this. Say this, say that. In essence, play the game. And there's been times when I've sort of said to her, yeah, but I shouldn't have to. I shouldn't have to. But then she often counters, she says, I don't care. All I care about is having you back home safely. Get over yourself. It's hard to argue with that kind of logic.
in pragmatic terms, but in principle, you're absolutely right. But in pragmatic terms, she has a point, and that's Denise's point as well. I mean, he recognizes that stereotype, Delroy, doesn't he? Because when he finds himself in prison, he thinks, oh my God, I'm just a number. I'm just another black man who got fucked by the police. I'm another one of these victims of this stereotyping, this image of black man as a threat to violence.
Yeah.
And actually, weirdly, even more disturbing for Delroy is when Carly somehow affirms the notion of the stereotype.
Yes.
When she says, you're the same as all of them. And he goes, what does she mean by all of them? Again, it's just this vast generalization.
Very much so. Yeah, he's let down by that because he just says, out of all the people out of your crazy family, I really thought you were the one who would understand me more because we loved me and we had a baby together. And then you come up with that. And then that really makes me even more frustrated and confused and angry.
Roy, I can hear your voice when Delroy says, what kind of narrow-minded bullshit was that? That sounds exactly like you to me. Quite rightly.
Oh, busted. I always try hard not to, from my voice, even though it's complicated, because even though the words come from me and Clint, but the fun of writing is you don't make it obvious. So I failed in that regard.
I'm not saying it was. It's just occurred to me now because I've heard you talk in these terms.
It's a compliment. I will take that. So thank you.
Okay, that's what I meant. Because what he's talking about is the racist picture of a black man. And he says that was the fact and nothing could now shake that. That picture of him. It ain't fair. And he has his day in court where he says, I'm going to be me in the hope you can see me, which goes back to they didn't want me to be me. But he tries to be himself. And it doesn't work. The judge just doesn't understand him. They don't speak the same language.
Exactly. He's from a different world, and the corridors of power in the courtroom are from a very, very different world. But yeah, that's all Delroy was trying to do. It's a plea. See me and really understand, because there's more about me going on than you think. I don't blame you because you are where you are and think what you think, but do the work.
Try and listen to me, yes.
Yeah, that's what, in essence, what he's trying to tell the country, everybody. Do the work.
He says to Michael, do the work as well, doesn't he?
He says that to Michael, yeah, and I think that line really echoes throughout the remainder of the play, because that's his rallying cry to Michael and to everybody, do the work. See me, value me, understand me, do the bloody work.
Understand the difference, understand what my perspective must be as well. What about the ending of part 2, Delroy's ending? Despite their inherited differences and challenges, we feel some hope for the future of Delroy and Carly and their new baby, don't we?
Yeah, again, we wanted to end on a sense of hope, because when she calls him and shows him his baby daughter, and I think that really just puts everything into perspective for me. That's what this is all about. It's all about her. My anger and what happened to me, none of that matters, because, I've created, at least I hope to create, a fact, a living, breathing fact, and that's what he says. That's more important than my feelings, my anger, and what the police think of me and what I think of the police. Here she is, this little girl who's my future, and possibly the country's future, the family's future. And she's from both of them, from both those worlds.
Yes, very important. Literally, she brings together both families, black and white. She's mixed race. And in fact, this the mischievous, again, I think, point where she's inherited Carly's father's nose.
I know. Again, we couldn't help ourselves. Yeah, he looks at him and he just says, "Oh my God, she resembles Alan Fletcher." And we just thought that's nice, naughty irony there.
A racist grandfather.
Yeah, exactly. And he's there. But yeah, Delroy kind of sort of like, okay, well, I need to deal with that and get over that. She's still my daughter and she's our future.
He says they're woven together now, which is nicely put. Okay, part 3, called Closing Time. Where did the idea of part 3 come from, and why 2 characters in this one?
I think it came from all the improvisations we had. So we had a history of Carly's relationship with Delroy and her relationship with Delroy's mum, Denise. So there were segments there, and we just lifted those out. And also, the story itself is a continuation from the film that we did, Face to Face, where Delroy and Michael meet. And that film ends with both families going into business together. They're going to have a shop. One half's going to be the florist, the other half's going to be a cafe where Denise sells West Indian food. So that ends on a positive as well. The families have come together. Then, at the beginning of the play, we see that the business has fallen through, and Denise and Carly are sort of forced to pick up the pieces. We thought, I mean, it was interesting because after we did Michael and Delroy, there was a real, and we took it as a compliment. There seemed to be a sort of rallying cry for, we want to know more. We want to see more points of views from different members of the family. And Carly was a very, very popular character that they very much wanted to see. They very much wanted to see her story. And so we kind of went along with that. But then we just kind of felt, well, let's sex things up a bit. Let's not take anything for granted. We just wanted to make it this trilogy. So that's why we decided, okay, for the final one, let's have a two-hander rather than a one-hander. Let's surprise ourselves as well as surprise the audience. So that's why we went with Carly and Denise.
So the 2 women, they have periods during the play where they talk on their own to the audience. So sort of do monologue where they play other characters as well, but then they also talk to each other. So it has a bit of both. And obviously you're giving the women a voice for the first time in a way.
Yeah.
The play has been dominated to date by the men, Alan in particular looming over it all. And then we have the intense relationship between Michael and Delroy and their perspectives on the world. And now we have a sense of the women coming out from under the patriarchy, so to speak, because they're running the business, by the way. The men are off just watching football in the pub.
Exactly. Being typical men.
As the women have it, the men are a bit useless, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and again, it felt right and fitting that we ended with those 2 women who have been commented on and talked about endlessly in the other 2. And so there's a sense of, okay, right, it's our turn. It's our turn to tell you how we feel and how we feel we've been defined by those 2 blokes. Hear us out now.
Yeah, and in fact, Denise talks about how during her entire working life as a nurse in a hospital, she describes the arrogance of the men in charge, which one can absolutely imagine.
Exactly, exactly. And she apportions a lot of that to, and it pains her to do it, she apportions a lot of that to her son. He's my son, I love him, but he's an idiot and he's let me down.
So for most of the play, they're in this joint venture together, but it's failed, possibly partly because of COVID. But there's a suggestion there's another reason this business has failed and that Denise blames Carly for. What is it that happened that Carly did that Denise is angry about that may have contributed to the breakdown of the business?
But what Carly did, and it's a hangover from the way Michael behaved in the first play, is that she went on a hen night and she got absolutely drunk and took way too many drugs and announces to her friends unknowingly she was unaware that she was being filmed while she was doing this. And she lists, here you are, mates, this is my 5 ways to keep your black man. And then she resorts to every sort of stereotype about black men. And it's coming from the dark side of her brain. And she just launches and just says it all in a sort of drunken, drug fueled state. And then it's posted on social media and everyone finds out about it. And I think that put the final nail in the coffin of their business. And Denise saw this video and was absolutely outraged and disgusted by it.
So people actually boycotted the store.
They boycotted it, yeah. And for us, that was a really interesting way to capture the mood of social media. You know, the whole issues of being triggered and
cancel culture.
Cancel culture, that's kind of what we're living in.
I mean, Carly is literally cancelled, isn't she?
She's very much so. And a lot of it, she's to blame for it. But we also wanted to have a bigger picture on that whole debate of cancel culture. So that's what happens to her. And then she's forced to kind of reevaluate herself again. And also reevaluate, more importantly, her relationship with Delroy. Because they were drawn together at a very young age. They were both very young teenagers. And they've had an on and off relationship for years, to the point where they finally got together and had a child together. And she says she loves him, but she needs to kind of get over her stereotypes of a black man She needs to stop sexualizing him and see him as a fully rounded human being. And that's what Denise, in her own way, challenges Carly to do. And that's a lesson Carly learns by the end of the play as well. That she asks herself, okay, do I really love this man? And that by the end, she's, yes, I do. I do love him. Drives him mad. He's got too many trainers in our flats. But
Yeah.
yeah, I do ultimately love him. That's where she comes out of it in the end.
And she has to reach some understanding of what it really means from the Black perspective, because what she does in her rant is she just spouts the cliches, and Denise quite rightly calls her out on it. She calls her a racial tourist, in fact, because Carly's understanding of Blackness has to be superficial compared to living as a Black person. And so she's right to call her out. But you're right about the cancel culture and social media. It's really painful to watch because Carly gets vilified. And so the personal pain and damage she suffers, the attacks on her, it's really ugly. And of course, this is really ugly. And it becomes very polarized. There are other white women in a racist form who support her, which is just absurd. But it is what happens on social media in this polarized world. And I think it raises, Roy, one of the themes of the play, which is about tolerance and understanding of other people's perspective.
Absolutely. And it's still debatable whether the use of social media is helping that or not helping it. It's a little bit of both. It's a very useful, there's also an overwhelming, powerful, dangerous tool that we have at our hands here. More of us should be aware of that. We have a responsibility in terms of what we see, what we view, and how we choose to do it.
I mean, we could spend a whole hour talking about the dangers of social media and the echo chambers we live in. But I was also interested in the nature of Carly's outburst, or the source of it is that there's very much a suggestion, isn't there, that she is to some degree inevitably inherited some of these racist ideas, attitudes from her father, from the society she's been brought up in, that almost she can't help herself.
Exactly. No, she can't. And we see that. We see that fight she's had from their age, very similar to Michael. I mean, they're brother and sister. So they both grew up in that house. They both heard what Alan had to say. And again, she wanted her father's approval as much as Michael did. I mean, we see it in the third play. There's a moment where she challenges it via her mum. She says, if you spoke to him, mum, and get him to stop, I think he would listen to you. So it's even then, there's a doubt in her mind at that early age. So by then, she's met Delroy and she's absolutely besotted with him. She knows it's wrong. She knows it's wrong what he's saying. And again, like human beings, we all have more than one thought in our head. She feels that way, but she still acts a certain other way.
And yeah, I mean, she said this wasn't me, but she behaved like that. And Denise did call her out on that as well. And it's basically, I think, what Denise calls her lens. It's prejudice that's built in almost to a white perspective in society. That's very, very hard to avoid.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, there's a real sense of a difference in cultural history. And one of the occasions where you explore this is they have an argument about the royal family.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about what this argument about the royal family tells us about their perspectives.
Well, it's Denise's point of view is a point of view I've heard from a lot of black people, and there's echoes of what I feel in there as well. Personally, I have nothing against the royal family, but I do think Britain itself hasn't quite acknowledged its history or the days when it was an empire, and it was an empire that did a lot of bad, committed horrific things. And I still think this is a country, this is a nation that still hasn't quite owned up to that, hasn't quite claimed responsibility. Because I think the way the world is now has a lot to do with that, and they should acknowledge that. I'm not looking for an apology, but just an acknowledgement that what they did was questionable and wrong, and apply it and use it to how it moves on. For me, that's why I feel personally what the main drive of all of this should be about.
It's interesting. Denise talks about the history of colonialization and in particular in the West Indies, and how even so recently that the compensation payments to slave owners have only just been completed. I mean, the craziness like that. And also that somehow that the royal family gives us a sense that you're better than everyone else.
And it fuels a lot of things that we've been talking about in terms of like racism and class and identity. It fuels all of that, and a lot of times in a not a very helpful way. So in that way, I question the royalty. As individuals, I don't necessarily have a problem with them, but in the bigger sense, I do.
You said somewhere that England has always had to be built on the remnants of what's left behind. So we do have to deal with this and come up with some future by acknowledging the past, because Carly does chime in during his argument about the royal family and says And I think there's a phrase you've used today even. We need to try and hold a complicated past and vision of the present and the future. We can hold two ideas in our head without trying to shit on one of them, can't we? We all just trying, right, to do that. And I think that was an interesting metaphor for the whole play. There's this polarized conflict, both sides of which have legitimacy, and nothing is black and white, but we need to somehow find reconciliation and an acceptance that accommodates both sides.
I think out of all the lines and scenes out of all three plays, I would say that is the most authorial from myself and Clint. I would say that moment when Charlie says that, that's what we want. That is literally what we want us as a nation to go forward, built on those words that Carly says. Let's try harder and build on what is left behind. Acknowledge, okay, things happened, but build on it. And I think that's something we're not doing. I think we're still holding, as a nation, attitudes, we're still built on Britain of the past. It's the whole, if I may borrow from America, the whole make America great again, almost. It's ridiculous. It's not about that. It's about moving on. It's not looking to the past. And I think we as a nation, we're still looking to that. We're sort of, I remember the old days when you didn't have to lock your door before we went out. Just nonsensical. And there was a time when Britain was great. And I always ask, well, when was that? When was that? Not when I was growing up. Not, what, post-war? It wasn't. Before the war?
And for whom? For whom was it great in this society?
And for whom was it great? It's never been great. But and I think the kind of joke is on us because we can be a great country. I have no problem with patriotism. I have no problem with Britain being called Great Britain. But there are people here living now who I think can contribute and make this country great if you bloody well give them a chance to. And I'm talking about the people who have been marginalised. All those diverse voices right here. Give them a chance, and I promise you, they'll make Britain great.
It's about how recognize that this is a plural, multicultural society now, that you can't go backwards. And actually, you should embrace the potential of that.
Absolutely. Embrace the potential.
When you talked about Carly trying, and I think Denise even talks about feeling a stirring of hope at the end. So you definitely, although, it's the death of England, you're definitely suggesting a potential rebirth, aren't you? Out of the ashes.
Out of the ashes, yeah. Even though the shop is closed, Denise and Carly, they've gone through all of this. They've gone through this whole debate within themselves, and they're there and they're clasping hands together. They're together and they're going to, okay, we're going to soldier on. She and I, we're going to soldier on. And that was as strong as image we wanted people to come out with at the end of that play.
Interesting closing time. It occurred to me about the title that it suggests finding closure.
Yes, and new beginnings.
Turning the page, yeah. And actually, out of the ashes, it just made me think, at the end of part one, they spread Alan's ashes on the football pitch.
Yes.
So it's literally out of the ashes. Great. Roy, thank you so much. It's been fascinating to have your perspective on these three brilliant plays.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the podcast, or one that's just a personal favorite. Now, I know this is a very hard question for someone who's immersed in the theater, but can you give us a play you'd love to recommend to our listeners?
Well, yeah, I can actually. It's a play that very much influenced me and changed my perspective on theatre. When I first read it, I was at an age where, I was falling in love with theatre, but at the time, all I was getting was Shakespeare, white characters speaking this kind of weird iambic pentameter dialogue. Not that I had a problem. I loved it. I kind of thought, oh, this is great. I'm really, really interested in this. But there's still a part of me just kind of felt, but I still feel slightly detached from it. I'm loving it. I like what I see, but I'm still feeling detached. And then a teacher at school, it shames me to say, I cannot remember her name. I wish I did. We sat down for registration and then she threw this play text down on my desk and she just said, read that. It was a play called Class Enemy, written by Nigel Williams, no relation. He's a wonderful writer himself. And to put it simply, the play is set in a classroom and these boys, they're problem kids, but basically it's a school where they get sent to because they've been causing problems in their other schools. They're like the Asbos of the day, very antisocial behaviour, troublesome kids who probably got mental issues as well. And they're there in this classroom waiting for this teacher to arrive, who doesn't arrive until the last act. And to pass the time away, they each give themselves lessons. And within that, you get a sense of who these boys are and what brought them to this classroom. And then you get little glimpses of, oh, these boys they've got potential. So it's a real damning statement on the education system of the time in England in the 70s. as well. It's a brilliant play, and I loved it because when I read it, I was 15 in my last year at school, facing an uncertain future, and there was these boys talking in the dialects that was really relatable. I just thought, they sound like me. They sound like my friends at school. And to read that for the very first time was really amazing, was mind-blowing and life-changing almost.
And the idea that boys like you could be the subject of art, of a play,
Exactly.
and even suggest that they have potential to be other than you expect them to be.
Absolutely. And that's really fed into stories I tell. That was a real massive influence on me, that play.
I can see where your works come from there. Thank you, Roy. That's a great suggestion. I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, Class Enemy, Nigel Williams.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great pleasure to meet you. Before we bring the curtain down, just to say that although the run at Soho Place is just finished as we record this, a new edition of Death of England, the Plays, that contains the text of all 3 plays in one volume with the updates made for this year's production has just been published by Methuen Drama. And you can even order it via theplaypodcast.com. If you do, you not only help support the podcast, you also support independent bookshops via our partner, bookshop.org, as we do with all of the play texts available for sale from our website. So, with references in Death of England to Windrush, the royal family, Brexit, or the ongoing agonies of the England football team, as well as to current topical issues and people, there is a strong sense in the plays of the arc of history in the continuing evolution of our collective idea of England. The fact that the nation's past so profoundly informs its present for good and ill. Its ills cannot be erased or escaped, but that doesn't mean that the present and future cannot move on from the past in important ways, particularly in recognizing the facts of racial history and prejudice and learning to understand and accept each other's entitlement to an equal part in the ever-changing new England. We can try. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.